We often talk about mainstream narratives of refugees and migrants, and one of the great things about refugee hosts and projects like it is not so much that it challenges the mainstream. It actually says, there aren't mainstreams, there are lots of streams, and they run into different estuaries, and they run together, and they spring up in different places. And if we see the world not as one stream with lots of tributaries off it, but actually a sort of joint streaming, then something very different emerges. It emerges not only transnationally, but also across history. So one of the big problems about powerful narratives to do with refugees and migration is that humanitarian policy and human rights policy are very, very amnesiac. They forget themselves. They forget their history. They're very, very presentist for some good reasons, because we have people suffering now. And we need to do things. But what the Refugee Hosts Project has done with tapping in to memory, the narrative of memory, is on the one hand transformed that into a kind of coming together of different, rather than seeing this refugee crisis with these people coming here, what we're seeing is these different historical narratives interweaving with one another. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, it's beautifully, what I'm saying is beautifully articulated in Yusuf's poem, Writing the Camp, which has this line, who are we to come to you and who are you to come to us? But it was also very, very palpable in the work we did with writers and artists in Lebanon and in Jordan. And I just want to give you two examples. One is from Lebanon, and where we were talking to people from Syria and some people who were hosting in Hamra, which is a district of Beirut. And a lot of this group were very interesting. A lot of them were filmmakers and writers already before they became, before they had to move to Lebanon, and had ambitions. And one of the things we did with our workshop, and this was thanks to Leonie Hirsch, one of our researchers, brilliant Leonie Hirsch, and Leonie had collected photographs of old Hamra, of old Beirut, from different eras, right through from the 40s and the Mandate days through to the kind of glamorous 60s, up until the present. And we were talking and writing and experimenting with these old black and white photos. And there was a woman in that group, really interesting woman, who was a war widow. She'd lost her husband in Syria. She had two very, very small children. She was very devout, so she was having problems with racism as well as all the other things she was having problems with in Beirut. And she started to write and speak really beautifully about a photo that showed old Hamra from the 1940s, and spoke about how quiet the roads looked and how safe the streets looked and how welcoming that Hamra was, and how beautiful, which of course it still is, but in those days it was absolutely gorgeous, it looked. And it enabled her to articulate, because today, as you know, Beirut's roads are treacherous. Anyone with small toddlers or children has a really hard time in making sure they get to one side of the sidewalk to the other safely. And it's noisy. And she was not experiencing welcoming. And through this, through her engagement with the past, her engagement with this photograph, she was able to produce this incredibly powerful narrative about longing for a refuge which wasn't the refuge that she had, which was not a longing for home, it was a longing for safety now. It's a really utterly beautiful piece of work. Through her engagement with history, it's not the sort of thing you get through a questionnaire, it's not the sort of thing you get through doing an interview. What Refugee Hosts is interested in is not relationships between people who have been displaced and people who are hosting them, but people who are hosts who have been displaced, that long narrative of displacement and the history, particularly in the Middle East, that is articulated every time someone moves. And this was really brought home to me in a workshop that we helped run in Jordan, in Jerash. All that group were talking about the importance of poetry to their lives and how poetry had travelled with them, and sharing their work enabled this amazing discussion about, again, the different histories of traveling, hosting, who was hosting who before. Parents and grandparents had made the same journey, down the Damascus Road, made it in the other direction. When people started writing, there was this absolute silence as people started writing for about 20 minutes of sheer concentration. But the conversation that came out of sharing the poems that emerged from that period of contemplation was a kind of making of a shared humanity. There were stories of losses, of suicides, of being widowed, that were in the community, but were finding a language to be spoken of because they were in the language of poems, in the language of storytelling, which is general as well as particular. So a lot of people say, refugee hosts, isn't it great? You've got poetry and art and things. You're humanizing people. People are, of course, already human. But the power of art and the power of poetry is to people to create that humanity together in a shared endeavor. So when Elena will talk about encounters or the undisclosed poetics of care, she says, another one of her powerful statements, that's precisely what that work of creativity, of thinking, of pausing, of finding the right metaphor, finding the right narrative can bring into the world. So in some ways, the question, why arts and humanities are important, is you can end up, spinning a lot of cliches when you answer that question, which quite often to policy and to purse holders are not that convincing. But what is so terrific about Refugee Hosts, and there are other projects like it, but I think this project is particularly successful, was to allow a kind of complex vision of a multifaceted, difficult to comprehend experience to drive the research, not for the research to drive the complexity of that experience and the difficulty of that experience underground. What then happens is, as far as sort of policy is concerned, is a complete opening out of what the question is on the so-called ground. And that can be, difficult for policy to engage with, or it can be more long-term productive for policy to engage with, because there are things that policy assumes are intangible, which a project like ours shows are not the intangible, they're the tangible things, they're the things that are making this thing work. Also to say, that if we're going to talk about the long history of refugees and migration, the suffering is often produced by instrumental answers to difficult questions. So, the frameworks with which the management of people is exactly managed. And as soon as you say the term management of people, anyone with any historical or ethical sense should have alarm bells going off in their head. Can actually produce more suffering, and in some ways nowhere is more exemplary of that than post-war Middle East. Non-instrumental thinking can produce solutions that require a kind of out-of-the-box acknowledgement of complexity. On the one hand, so if you say how do the humanities help humanitarian gestures, like how can humans help humans, is actually what I was saying. I think one of the things that two things humanities has, it has memory. Memory is our business, and it has narrative, it has storytelling. Those things together make human experience endure. So the ability to memorialize, the ability to narrate is a way of making sure human experience endures. Humanitarianism has a very, very checkered history. It was very closely linked to colonial histories in a previous moment. It's very closely linked to geopolitical master narratives in the 20th century. It's also linked to great radicalism. It's also linked to, as it says, in the title, of bringing together of human courage and human grace. But I think when the humanitarianism forgets memory, forgets narrative, and forgets history, it is usually at that moment that it is failing in some sense. So my argument has always been actually the humanitarian policy in particular needs humanitarian use the humanities in some ways as much, if not even more, than it needs social science and other approaches, because a kind of language where you see other human beings as something to be fixed is already, I think, has opened up a moral and political lead or gap between the people you're working with, people you think you're helping, and the greater project of humanitarianism.